Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lang this afternoon. The title, Analyzing and Teaching Concepts to Higher Functioning Children, is one I'm sure that you are all very, as we all are, very tuned in and interested in. Before Dr. Lang starts, I have a couple announcements. As you know, we've gone green. Dr. Lang's presentation will be on the patent website soon. Too loud? Okay. Well, if that continues, then I'll be sure and get someone. We are doing a live webcast with the presentation today. But as I said before, his presentation will be on the patent website that you can download at some point in the near future. Today, the exhibit hall is open until 5 p.m. This afternoon at 4:30, the special event is a tribute to Dr. Jerry Shook. That is in, I think it is in President's 1, but I'll find that out for sure. I would encourage you to attend. All sessions have codes, and I will be providing that at the end of Dr. Lang's presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lang. Dr. Joe Lang, co-founder of HeadSprout, which was acquired by Newell and Rubbermaid in spring of 2011 and merged into its interactive teaching technologies company, Mimeo. He currently serves as Mimeo's Director of Learning Sciences. Dr. Lang led the scientific team that developed HeadSprout's patented Sprout Learning technology. This technology forms the basis of the company's HeadSprout early reading and reading comprehension programs, for which Dr. Lang was the chief architect. Dr. Lang earned a PhD in behavioral science, that is biopsychology, from the University of Chicago, where he collaborated on research investing the abduction of untrained complex symbolic repertoires from simpler behavioral components, which led to some of the key elements upon which the HeadSprout learning technology is based. Dr. Lang has over 35 years of experience in experimental and applied learning sciences with a particular focus on the design of instruction. In 1992, Dr. Lang co-authored the seminal paper on generative instruction, which appeared in the American Psychologist. He also has extensive clinical experience and currently is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Joe Lang.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Chief architect means everybody else did all the work. It's a great title to have. It's a great thing to have, you know. You kind of lay out your vision and really bright people, then take it over, and then you bring it back to you and you go, oh, that's not quite it, or yeah, a little more of that, a little less of this. And pretty soon you got an amazing product. I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. After lunch, I'm sure everyone's kind of nodding off a little bit. We'll do what we can to keep things rolling here. I was talking this morning, I did this workshop earlier this morning, so some of you may have talked to colleagues who did it, and I hope they didn't give away any of the punchlines here of anything that I'm doing, either the jokes or the content. But it's actually closer to 40 years I've been actually doing this concept business here. And I know that's hard to believe, but I was a prodigy. I started when I was 4. And I just started analyzing concepts one day as I was walking, you know, preschool activity. But actually, there's a little bit of truth to that, not about the 4-year-old part, unfortunately. But it is true that I was thinking back that in 1972, I did a series of workshops throughout West Central Illinois. It's a part of Illinois where there's no four-lane highway running through to this day. There wasn't one in 72, there's still none today. They used to call it the Forgotatonia, the part of Illinois everyone forgot. But I went around to the elementary schools and about how to teach concepts. And we had a workshop called Really Understanding Concepts, and we brought this out to the communities and so forth. And I'd like to say how, you know, the use of teaching concepts and what we've known about it and so on expanded from that time and is now routine in educational practice. Unfortunately, it's not. I travel all over the country. Actually, I travel over the world. That wasn't too long ago. I was meeting with the Ministry of Education for the country of Turkey, where I'm doing a project with them. And they're putting interactive technologies into 900,000 classrooms, equipping each child in Turkey with a tablet, looking at developing some really powerful teaching curricula and techniques and so on, and have massive effort. And it's actually a focused $8 billion effort to upgrade the instructional technology in the country. It kind of makes me cry when I get back to the United States and people are trying to get enough money to not to have 50 kids in the classroom, you know. But so that's another topic, I guess, another talk. Now that I brought everybody down, I'll continue with the talk here. But at any rate, what we find is that in 1971, an investigator by the name of Clark did a meta-analysis, and if you were at Dr. Twyman's talk yesterday morning, she talked about meta-analyses as putting together and analyzing a group of studies to come up with a common theme or outcome that we can then have some confidence in. And Clark investigated 235 studies on the teaching of concepts. Now, that's not a handful, that's a lot. And they're all listed in his paper. And what was fascinating, these were across disciplines and often countries. Cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, information processing theory, communications theory, all of these had different traditions and different investigators. What was fascinating is that they all came to the same conclusion. There is an optimal way to analyze, structure, and teach concepts that the research literature has demonstrated. In 1989, David Merrill repeated the investigation that Clark did in '71. Came to the exact same conclusion, even now with more studies. So we would assume that this technology and sets of procedures would be mainstay and a staple of what's taught in colleges of education throughout the country. And in reviewing syllabi, I find almost no examples of this work being taught to students as part of their teacher preparation. It's fascinating to me as to how something so well established in the experimental and applied literature where they actually go out in the classrooms and have done this work. It's not like it's just done in little laboratory studies. And the power of this is basically unknown. And further, how important it is to really producing higher functioning children. One of the things that I've come to understand, and as we've developed reading and comprehension programs and so on, is the importance of vocabulary. And what does it mean to understand or know a vocabulary word? What does it mean to teach vocabulary? And what we find is that if one does not understand it at the conceptual level of what it is, one does not have full access to that meaning. And we'll talk about that as we proceed through this presentation today. We'll see what I mean by that and what's going on. So concept is a very, very interesting area, and we're going to actually investigate the concept of concept. All right, makes sense, kind of. And it is relative. You may have, if you at all go to some of the VB workshops and so on that Mark Sumberg and other people do, you'll hear a word called a tact. And tact is a term developed by Skinner, and it came from coming in contact with the environment. That's where the tact part comes from. And it means that a verbal response is under the control of a nonverbal stimulus. And so if I have the word concept written on the or projected, and you say concept, well, that's not a tact, that's called a textual response. In other words, you're reading it, right? But if you look at that and say English, you tacted the language it was written in, all right? And these tacts are broken down into categories. And you have all these different categories of tact. And one of the categories is called an abstract tact. And basically what we mean by concepts here is an abstract tact. It means that there are features or properties of a stimulus, of an occasioning event, that guide our behavior that have been broken away from the other properties of that event. So it's a subset of properties that is critical to our responding. And when we respond to the subset, we are saying we are behaving to the abstract tact. But we're not going to use that terminology because, you know, we have another word called concept. And we're just going to say, for the sake of our discussion, they're homologous, they're the same word, all right? Abstract tact, concept. Now, other people may define concepts differently than that, but that's what I mean by it. It's synonymous with abstract tact. All right? So, concepts, we all have them. At least we think we do. All right? And the question is, what are they and why? And we all think they're important, even if we don't know quite what they are. All right? And the question then becomes, well, how do we tell one when we see one? What is it like? And so if I were to ask you right now to write down what you think a concept is, actually, if you got a piece of paper, why don't you just do it? Just write down what you think a concept is. And if you had lunch with someone who took the workshop before, don't cheat. Come on. Think about what it was before you had lunch. All right. All right? Now, I'm not going to have you read out your definitions. I just want you to write it down so that you have a record of what you thought it was beforehand. So you can be honest with yourself here as you go through. But how many here are teachers in this audience? All right, great. And the rest of you do what? I mean, if you're not a teacher, what do you do? And we've got case managers and what else? Parents. Parents are teachers, aren't they? All right, but yeah, okay, parent teachers, all right. I know I'm a parent, and I did a lot of teaching and cajoling and crying. And yeah, as a matter of fact, I'll never forget, I used to drop my older son off at his pre-K, which was a private pre-K. And I'd pull up in front, and every day, without fail, I would say to him, the difference between this Ford Escort and a BMW is that school. Have a nice day. Roughly about the same monthly payment difference. Just wanted to let you know, kid. And so I don't think he understood, but it made me feel better. I was telling him. Yeah, he goes, I don't care. He's only 4 years old. What's he care about BMW's Ford Escort? But I just wanted him to know I was sacrificing. So so parent business is really important. And actually, a parent is why I'm giving this talk. I had a parent come up to me after I spoke here in 2008, and we were talking, and I covered concepts just as a little part of another presentation I was doing, and he came up and he said, oh, now I understand why my son never seemed to get above a certain level in his vocabulary. I was teaching it all wrong. When I taught him what a fish was, I'd show him 2 or 3 pictures of a fish and say fish, and he would say fish. And when he saw those and I thought he understood what a fish was and he had the vocabulary of fish, now I understand he didn't and could not appreciate what a fish was throughout all the literature and the conversations he'd have about fish. And I looked at that and I said, you know, that man's right. And so we need to talk more about concepts, vocabulary, and maybe not fish, but we might end up talking about some fish. So there are differences between concepts and some of the other things we do. There are things called paired associates. So if I look at city versus Paris, city is a concept, Paris is not. Why not? Paris doesn't vary. Well, it builds new buildings from time to time and they do things. But Paris as an entity is a particular city in France. It is not a concept. But city, and what makes up a city is a concept. Look at this. Something complicated as the special theory of relativity is not a concept. It doesn't vary. It is what it is. Now, it has concepts embedded in the theory, but the theory itself doesn't vary. Concepts have to vary from instance to instance, and this does not. Speed, which is a big part, of the theory, special theory of relativity, the speed of light and relative speed of objects and so on, and their relation, is a concept. So speed, which seems much simpler than the theory of relativity, is actually a concept, whereas the special theory of relativity is not. So complexity isn't what makes something a concept. It's, well, how much it varies, which we'll talk about more. Letters, as a concept, A, B, and C is not. A is not a concept, B is not a concept, C is not a concept, right? As I said, paired associates don't vary very much. There's some variability in them, but they don't vary very much from each other. And whereas concepts vary a great deal from one another, typically looking very different. So a chihuahua runs through the room, and right behind it comes bounding a St. Bernard. They're both dogs. They don't look very much alike. All right? But yet, we both say they're dogs. There's something about that, those two critters, that allows us to classify them and respond to them in the same way, even though they vary from example to example. All right? So the question is, what makes a chair a chair? Here's an example of a chair, right? Well, what makes it a chair? If I were to say, oh, we need another chair in this room, we don't, obviously. But if we say, we need another chair in this room, would you go and get me a chair? Not a single person here would come in and drag in a table. Or maybe a couch, unless that was the only thing left to sit on. But you'd bring something that looks relatively close to something like you're already sitting on. But what is it? Why do you do that? And then the greater question is, how do we get other folks to do that, our learners in particular? All right? So here's our chair. And this is a non-example of a chair. Something that isn't a chair. What's different? All right, there we go. More than one person sits on the chair. And that's it. That is indeed important. So the first step we look at is say, okay, we changed it. More than one person sits in. Is there anything else? Now, if I have something that seats one person, is there anything else that seats one person, right, that is in a chair? All right? And there's something different about these. What's different here? I'm sorry? Perhaps. All right, yeah. One has a back and one does not. When we see things that don't have backs, what are they? Stools, yeah. Or if they seat more than one person, they're a bench, right? So we see that we have, so seats one person and has a back, right? Oh, I don't have it yet. Here it comes up. Seats one person and has a back. Now, is there any other thing? Let's try this. We have seats one person. It has a back, but we don't call that a chair there on the left. What do we call it? A what? Bar stool. We've got someone here, a lot of experience here. Edging out the bar stool. Now what makes this a bar stool and not a chair? It seats one person has a back. The height, right. Your legs are left dangling, right? All right, so your legs then are supported about 90 degrees when it's a chair. So these are three critical features of a chair. Any one of those are absent and you don't have a chair. All three of those must be present to have a chair, right? Now, what's fascinating about what we did here and going through this is that by comparing these examples and non-examples, we will be able to pick this apart pretty quickly. And so will any learner, by the way. So the key element that we're going to find is that we have to have examples and non-examples. And the examples and non-examples have to be selected in a very precise way. Now, it's one thing to tell a chair from a not a chair. It's another thing now to identify all chairs as chairs. All right? Now, our chairs can be made out of cloth or wood or plastic or metal. They can be any color, right? Some of those look more comfortable than others, I have to admit. But the full range of things that are classified as chair. Now, look, they all share the critical features, right? They have a back, seat one person, and legs are supported about 90 degrees in all of those examples. If our learner is said to have chair, and here's some of the other varying properties here. If our learners are said to know the concept of chair, to have the concept of chair, they should, having never seen these chairs before, be able to label them as chairs. Say, oh, that's a chair. Or if I say sit on the chair, they go over and sit on it. If I say bring me the chair, they bring it to me versus something else in the room. A variety of behaviors could indicate that they're responding to the critical features. But those are the range, and there's probably even a larger range of things of chair. So if I want to test whether my learner has the concept of chair, I have to do two things. I have to make sure that they don't include things that aren't chairs, love seats, bar stools, right? Couches, things like that as chairs. And I have to make sure that they can identify all these with all these variant properties as chairs. It is only then can I claim to have taught the concept. If I haven't tested for this, I can't assume that they know it. All right? So here is, all of these are similar. They share some of the features, but they lack one or more of the critical features of chair. So this is some of our non-examples. All right? Now, on these, notice that when these were presented, they only varied on the basis of the critical feature. I could have presented that red chair with, let's say, a wicker love seat. That was completely different material, different color, maybe didn't have any arms. If you think about that last picture I had a picture of one of those as a non-example up there. If I did that and I said, what's the difference between these? The fact that it seats more than two people, I mean more than one person, seats two people or more, would be obscured by the fact that it's also made out of a different material. It may be lighter, it may not have arms, it may be of a different color. So what we find that when we're teaching concepts, the way to learn them is to set it up so the discrimination is based only on the difference in the must-have features, critical features. It's really easy to make that distinction on chair and non-chair when the only thing varying are those critical features. And so this is part of what we're going to learn today of how to set this up, analyze these, match those varying features so that the discrimination is only along these critical features. Now here's an important point. The concepts we're going to look at today are very complex. I decided to go for the gold and do some complex concepts. But the important thing is to understand is that these are concepts you know already, but probably can't define. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? You know it, but can't define it. If you think back to chair, you probably wouldn't have come up with the definitions that we had for chair either. Your learners don't have to know it in the sense of being able to define it. So really understanding the concept isn't about being able to say the definition. Having a good vocabulary. How many people have kids and they'd say, Mom or Dad, what does this mean? And they say a word and you go, how's it used in the sentence? Right? Read me that paragraph. And they read you the paragraph and you know precisely what it means, but you stumble around trying to think of a good way to define it. Right? But you know exactly what it means. You understand precisely what that paragraph is about. Means that you can respond to examples of it and not respond to non-examples perfectly, even if you can't say it. And that's really the goal of what we want for our learners. We're not here to have them go through a bunch of spouting off of definitions. What does that mean? You don't have to be a speaker in terms of verbally. I'm not talking about behavioral speaker, but I'm talking about having a speaking mechanism, if you will, or be vocal to understand complex concepts. It's not necessary. So when you say, well, some kids can't express themselves verbally, that's okay. That's not required. Because almost nobody in here could express themselves verbally on what a chair is, but you all understood it. And so can the kids. So that's a really powerful thing, because you can have a very sophisticated conceptual understanding without being able to say anything about it. All right, so here you go. Ready? Drum roll. All right. A concept is a class of stimuli, each instance of which shares some features or properties with other instances of the class while varying across many other properties. And I'm sure everyone wrote that definition down earlier on, right? You all had that written down. All right, so let's try this to kind of make it a little more clear. All right? The shared properties define the class, the concept. These shared features are the must-have features that define something as an example of a concept. The other features are those the example can have, but don't define it as an instance of the concept. So what we're looking at when we do a concept analysis, we're trying to find the must-have features and distinguishing them from the can-have features. And making sure the can-have features don't get confused with the must-have features. That's our job. Pretty simple to say. Not exactly simple to actually do, as you'll see. All right, we talked about a chair, which is pretty straightforward, meaning that you can bring one out in the world and you can find examples of chairs and not chairs and so on. But how about more subjective concepts? Concepts that take up hours and hours of discussion in philosophy courses, but are also important in everyday life, particularly of children. Because not every concept you want to teach the child is of things they see in the room. How about this concept? Wouldn't you like to be able to teach a child what believe means? Or to believe, or believing? What is it? What is someone doing when they're believing something? Can we teach that? How do we come to grips with such a concept? Isn't it something, a belief is something that you hold internally and that you act upon, and you hear all the discussions on it. So if I'm going to teach a child, particularly children who have challenges in this area, what am I going to do? Well, typically I don't do it. I don't teach believe. That's too abstract. But what I think we can find is that's not the case. All right? So here we can look in the dictionary. It's always fun. So I brought one with me so you don't have to look it up here. All right? So we're going to look in the dictionary. And the first thing you see, of course, is the pronunciation guide. And then you see the, I accept as true, feel sure of, truth, and so on and so forth. How am I going to teach that? What are the critical properties of that? What's the must-have properties there? That's a tough one. Well, let's look at the next one. Accept the attainment of something as true but didn't believe. Oh boy, that's another good one here. Have faith, especially religious faith. Oh, that clarifies it. That narrows it right down. I know exactly what it is now, right? And you can just go right through these. And what you find is the dictionary is often of absolutely no help. The people who write the dictionaries don't know how to define never did a concept analysis either. They do the best they can. Now, sometimes you can get some hints. I'm not saying don't look in the dictionary, but don't rely on the dictionary for your concept analysis. All right? So what do we look in here? And so what do? How do we figure out what it is to believe if we can't believe the dictionary? All right? All right? So what do we contrast with? What is it? What can we contrast to believe with? It's to believe versus to what? To know. All right? So if we said that automatically, obviously you know what it means. Because immediately you say, oh, well, it's not believing and knowing are two different things. And so here's the secret sauce here. And quite interestingly, Skinner talked about this, and independently, analytic philosophers also looked at this problem. Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is impossible to read, but be my guest and try, actually came up with the solution to this problem. And it's the same solution actually as posed by Skinner, interestingly enough. And that is, the belief isn't something you hold internally, in essence, that then governs your outward behavior, because there's no fact about a fact that I can examine that will tell me whether that belief is there or what it takes. That's what Wittgenstein demonstrated. But by what criteria do we use when looking at someone believing that we say they're believing? What are the external criteria that are applied to the act? What is it we're doing? And how does that differ from to know? All right? So, this is the question. What do we do? All right? So, critical events. So let's look at believing. I get the grill. I put the aluminum foil on it, and I put the coals in, and I get the match, and I use self-lighting since I'm really lazy, and it's probably no good for me. It's probably got all sorts of chemicals. But anyway, I'm putting the coals in, and I put it on there, and someone says, what are you doing? I said, oh, my wife's stopping at the store and going to bring home steaks. Well, are the steaks there? I have a pretty firm what? Belief that my wife will bring home the steaks. Now, you may turn to someone and say, he really believes that his wife's going to bring home these steaks. You know how hard that woman works and all this type of thing, and takes a lot for granted and blah, blah, blah. He really believes that? Now, what causes that person to say, I really believed it? What am I doing that person says, I believe my wife will bring home steaks? Even if they never said anything to me. If they just saw what I was doing. What am I doing that causes someone to say, I believe it? I'm sorry, what? I'm setting up the grill. In the absence of what? Evidence. Absence of the stakes. In the absence of the stakes, I'm setting up the grill. All right? So, an absence of an event is occurring, and I'm taking action that affirms the existence of the event. I'm going to get the stakes. If I'm setting up the grill and the stakes are on the table next to me, I know I'm going to have the stakes. The stakes, right? I know I'm going to have it. I don't believe it. I know it. They're here. And so what we see is that if we begin to look at the criteria, that whole complex thing that the dictionary had in there is actually boils down to this. And this will cover every instance of belief. Absence of an event, action taken that affirms the event. One of the examples you're going to see here is of a dog that I open the cupboard door and the dog runs to its bowl. Oh, and what did you say? Hey, he believes he's going to be fed. That's different than having food in his bowl. Why is he running to the bowl? Oh, he knows he's going to be fed. He can see the food there. Yeah, but opening the door, believes he's going to be fed. There's no food there, but he's acting as though there is. All right? So this is what we're talking about now in terms of trying to develop our variable attributes. Those can have features. And this is where sometimes these more abstract concepts, the rubber kind of meets the road. And I'll just go through these and you'll see. Now it says number 3, that means 1 and 2 were the first 2 attributes, right? Absence of an event, action taken that affirms the likelihood of the event or the existence of the event. All right, time frame can happen in the future. I believe they will do something. I believe they are doing something. I believe something has been done. All right? The type of event. It can be a mechanical event. I believe the machine will work or start. All right? It can be a natural event. It can be a mythical or supernatural. I pray to the gods, and they'll do something for me. It can be an intrapersonal, something I believe about myself. I'm going to do something. I believe I'm going to get sick. I know it. All right? It can be interpersonal. And it can be social. All right? But wait. I feel like Ron Popeil. You guys know Ron Popeil? Set it and forget it, but wait, there's more. You can get 2 rotistries. Never mind. All right. Okay. Who takes action? Yourself, other person, an animal, type of action taken, verbal, nonverbal, conditions that suggest the event, could be next step in a sequence, can be instruction or other verbal stimulus, outcome of an event. All right, all of those things, I'm going to go back to that. I got to go through these, get these all up here. Whoops, I'm doing too much. Come on. Let's see if I can go backwards. Yeah. All right, I have to step through these here. Pardon me for my mess. My finger actions aren't quick on the draw here as I should be here. All right. But you get to read them again. This is all very helpful. Repetition, you know, here. All right. What we're going to do then, once we have all those varying properties, and there's a lot of them there, right? I have to make sure that in my examples for my learner, I'm varying every one of those features. so that when I do design my example set, I have to make sure that somehow those are all exemplified. And if I have roughly 6 levels within one category, that means I have to have a minimum of 6 examples. All right, a minimum of 6 examples. I have to have a minimum of 2 non-examples. So my minimum teaching set is going to be 2 non-examples and 6 examples. All right, here's the first one. They see no one trapped inside a burning building, but everyone is not accounted for. They decide to look inside. Absence of the person inside, right? But you go inside to look because you believe someone might be in there. And notice that that is varying attributes 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, but it's 3B, 4B, 5B, 6B, and 7B. If you went back and looked at those lists that I had, and you can do that when you download it off the list, you can go back and say, oh, this has every one of those varying properties in that example. So by having this one example, I give my learners experience with all those varying properties. All right, this one varies 3B, 4C, 5A, 6A, and 7C. What we're doing here is developing what's called a rational set. These are the rationale for selecting these examples. I'm systematically varying them to give my learner the experience they need to be able to go through these. All right, the car's been sitting for a month and I get my keys to start it. It's varying those properties. The dog runs back and forth. It's varying those. All right. I look in the mirror and take cold medicine, varying those properties. So this is my minimum set that you're seeing here. My 6 examples. Here's the bad news, folks. It's liable to take more than 6 examples to teach this. So you're going to have to come up with some more. And here's the other bad news. You got to come up with a fresh set of 6 examples to test. Because you've got to have examples that your learner has never seen before, but that share all these varying properties. Now, I don't have to share them in the same way, but they have to make sure that all the properties are mixed and matched, and so that they extend it across all of those events. For our products that we produce commercially, we do this for every concept that's embedded and taught. We're doing a product group right now of the 200 most difficult concepts for science teachers to teach in grades 3 through 8. And we've done a full concept analysis and then sequence to teach them for those 200 concepts. Things like thermal energy transfer. Right? You got to know the concept of thermal, energy, and transfer. Thermal energy transfer is actually a principle, but don't want to nitpick here. But the fact is, this is what has to be done and sequenced. Probably have to come up with some more because they may not get it with just these few. But there's some really wonderful things that we'll see later on that this allows you to do that if you don't do it, actually causes you more work. So the work comes up front, but makes your instruction much easier. Now, I have to have my minimum non-example. So now look, someone is seen trapped inside a burning building and a rescue is attempted. This would be matched with the one where there's a burning building and no one is seen. And the question to the learner is, what's the difference? This one's believe. This one isn't believe, right? This is believe. Now here, this one's believe. This one isn't. What's the difference between the two? All right? Here's our dog. It would be matched. This dog believes, this dog just doesn't. What's the difference? Well, the door is open, but there's no action taken on this one, right? And the other one, action's taken, but the event is there. We know it. You see how those are varied against each other? Now, you're probably going to need more non-examples than this. This is the minimum set, what's called the minimum rational set. Typically, for kids who need some extra instruction, you can actually teach a concept such as this in probably 15 to 25 step sequence. Not hundreds and hundreds of trials, if you've done it and set it up correctly. And you really don't use match to sample to do it. And you don't have to go through all the symmetry and all this other flip-flopping stuff and hundreds of trials. You can get these relations taught really quickly if you do the upfront analysis and sequence it appropriately. So yeah, it takes work on the upfront side, but on the teaching side, you're going to have less work. And once you've done it, you've got it. For every learner that comes after that. All right. So what we're going to ask is, we start out and say, given a concept you want to teach, what's the opposite? Remember, to believe it was to know. For a chair, it was against a couch. For, or a sofa, I guess, in some parts. When I was growing up, it was always a couch. I don't know, maybe some people had sofas in their houses, but we had couches. For believe, to know, coach, you know, the opposite. What is it? And then you ask yourself, well, what criteria are being placed on that to tell me that it's different, that it's opposite? What makes you say that it's opposite? And then you go to the next one is, well, what's close in? Now that I've got the feature that makes it different, is there something that has those features that still isn't an example? Now you move a little closer in. Now remember, we said, okay, it seats one person. Now is there anything that seats one person that still isn't a chair? That's the next question you ask. So you start out far out, we say, and you bring it in closer in. You know, what is the difference is the question you want to ask. And then you can ask, how is it used? Am I doing something with it that's different? And that means, what are the different contexts we hear the word used? When I hear the word believe, well, I hear it used in this context and that context. Do I have it all? And what I'm doing here is I'm looking for all my varying properties, right? Now I'm looking for, now that I've got pretty much the critical element, where do I hear? Every time I hear, well, I hear it being believed, I hear people talk about believing in terms of mechanical things and religious things and social things, and I go through, and you start just listing them out. Where do I hear it? And that brings you into contact with what the can-have features are. All right? Now, I'm going to show you a concept here. And this particular concept, and I put my head down here, is really hard. All right? I mean, it's hard. I'm not making any bones about it. The word isn't difficult, and you all know it. This is one you all know. But it's hard. All right? Distant. What? If you're teaching someone the concept of distant, what the heck do you have to do? All right? All right, so, far away. Well, you know what that is? That's called not a definition, it's called a synonym. In other words, it means the same thing as distant, but what does it mean to be far away? All right? We can't get off the hook that easy. But it can begin to bring us into contact, right, with what we're doing. All right? So we have to ask ourselves, what does far away mean? And we need to begin to look at all the conditions under which, in our common usage, we hear the word distant used. All right? Now, what we'll find is that something that is distant under one context isn't distant under another context. You'll find out right away that you're dealing with relative scales. Relative to this badge, that chair is distant to me. But relevant to the chair in the back, this one's near and that one's distant. It's flipped. So what we begin to see, and it causes our legs to tremble and our hands to sweat, is that we're dealing with something here that isn't easy to pin down. Now, if it isn't easy for you to pin down, guess who it's not even going to be more difficult for? And then let's look at all the varying features in distant. All right? So let's go look at a couple of them here. We can be distant in terms of space. A distant hill, a distant ridge. See the guy there? And distant from that referent person there to the hill? That's a distant view, right? Well, here now, the landscape's close up, but the people are distant. All right? So if I were teaching this, I'd want to have close people who are close and views that are distant, and views that are close and people who are distant. All right? But, so spatial distance is something. And here's one where, well, it's distant from the point of view of the viewer is the person, but more distant or distant from the viewer is the hill. There's a mix in the first two. See how complicated this is getting? When I said it wasn't easy? And then, if you remember this one, and this. The sun is really distant. This one's near. The sun is really distant. So you've got distance related on the Earth, outside the Earth, celestial distances, microscopic distances. When you deal with cells, they're called proximal and distant. You know, the near and the far parts of a cell. So that the proximals tend, and so that, and you're talking about a little cell. But that they're talking about it being distant end of the cell versus the near end, the proximal end. All right? So we got this relative scaling going on. But how about this one? Social distance. Now these folks are relatively close together, but they're the modern American family. You know, on the computer, one's on the computer, the other's watching TV or playing a video game or something. And versus, all right, we have our folks here who's in New York, and she's talking to them in Chicago, right? So here's the question. Which one is socially distant in this group? Which one is spatially distant? So it shifts now, not by a relative standard based on distant measurement, but on the context of whether you're talking about social or spatial. Think of that for your learners. And there has to be a set of critical features that cut across both of those examples, that make them both distant, that do not vary, even though we got all this variation going on. And there's more. How about temporal? We got a distant relative back there. Although that depiction of evolution is probably wrong, by the way. There's increasing evidence that apes derive from an upright, walking critter that both apes and humans evolved from, and that we didn't evolve from knuckle walkers. That knuckle walkers evolved from and us evolved from a common ancestor. So this isn't quite accurate, but you know, I guess it's where you draw the line on the list here. But no, and actually it's not linear, it's a branch, it's a bushy branch tree. I'm I love paleoanthropology, and so I kind of nitpick on these things, but there's not a really good application. But you get the idea that something occurred a long time ago versus recently, that's distant, right? Temporally distant. And, oh, I got a plan for a date that's distant. A date can be distant in the future of my calendar. And I can look at how something unfolds over time. And with time elapsed, I can go back and forth. This one is, and I got relative levels of distance through time. Temporal distance. Now wait a minute, so we've got, all right, we've got, oops, I don't know if I'm going to have you do this. I shouldn't have put this up yet, but because of the layout of the room. But we have temporal distance, social distance, right, and spatial distance. Now, what could be the critical features, given what we discussed, of distance? That would apply to all those examples. So, do you guys want to take a shot at figuring it out? Do you feel like, you know, in a typical workshop, that's what we do, you know. And there's a lot of folks here, and there's not tables, and I don't know if you have paper. But I would like for you to do that. Why don't we take some time here, get together, build, you know, you're kind of coalesced around certain groups. Go together and spend a few minutes talking about what would be the must-have features that could cut across all those different examples. Remember we talked about far away, relative scales, all that? Give it a try. All right. All right, let me go through here. All right. All right, so we're doing our analysis, and these are not simple. When you sit down to actually do them, and that's why I like to have folks do it and actually try it. And sometimes it's challenging and it feels uncomfortable to do that, but I guarantee you that a lot of really smart people who are really skilled at doing this can take a very long time to analyze some very difficult concepts. We, in our program on our reading comprehension program, we looked at analyzing the concept of inferential, as I mentioned, inferential comprehension, literal, main idea or mostly about, and derived word meaning. It took us 1.5 years for those 4. Those 4 took 1.5 years. Now, we did it at a level of analysis and tagging and so on that you don't have to do. But it is not an easy, all the time easy task, particularly when you're, working with kids who you can't make any assumptions about, and particularly in designing your sequence. And if anyone is interested in reading about that effort, we actually published it. It's in the Behavior Analyst Today online journal, volume 12. We have 3 papers. What you're really will be looking at is number 2 and number 3 in the series. Number 1 is all highly theoretical. As a matter of fact, it has a quote, an opening quote. It's a quote that you see at the University of Chicago. It's a T-shirt. And the T-shirt says, "That's all fine and well in practice, but how does it work in theory?" And that is actually a very popular T-shirt at the university there. And so that's how it is. So the first one's all theory, but the second 2 are actually how we actually went about doing it and what was done. All right, so ready? Drum roll. First one. You have a comparative, quote, further off, separation. In other words, you always have to be comparing to something. You can't have distant without having distance between somethings. So it's comparative, and you're comparing it to some standard. Now that standard could be something it's distant relative to this object here based upon how I'm measuring it in my standard. This is true for social, temporal, or spatial. So the 2 critical attributes. And it looks very, very complex when you start to deal with it. But when you get to this, and many of you did, now, you don't have to use the same exact words. It's, representing the same thing. Now you can begin to use this to structure, the entire variable attribute. So you go and say, okay, what are all the things where I need to vary in terms of spatial distance? What are all the contexts? And so you go and examine those. And you do the same for what are the various social contexts? You go and examine those. The temporal. So that would give you your varying properties. And then you would take some of those and you would match them where it's not. There's an example of distant. And the non-example of distant is, of course, near. All right? And the common definition of near is close. And its critical attributes are very similar. It involves a separation, but it's closer relative to some standard. In other words, I've got this, and this is level closer relative to the standard versus this, which is more distant. This is the standard what's there, and it's relative. So something that can be close or near in one situation is distant in the other, and flip back and forth. So what you see is the actual objects that make up things distant and near are varying properties. It's only the relation between the objects. And if you can establish guidance by these 2 properties, now that doesn't mean that the learner can recite those properties. I guarantee you, none of you in this room last night, when you said, oh, that's way across town, that's really distant, said, and you realize what I am doing is telling you a comparative example based upon a standard here, right? That's what I'm doing. No, you didn't do that, but you knew exactly what you're doing. And so your learners don't have to do that. They just have to be able to say when something is an example of distant, and when something is an example of near, across those range of varying properties. And when you do that, you've taught them something very complex, something that cannot be articulated with a simple, objective example, but something they can learn because you analyzed it and set up the sequence. It's really amazing to see, and it's really powerful. And it's now 2:30, so this is a great time to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll learn more about how to do this and what goes into it in part 2. 15 minutes, okay? Right, when I was entering the room, I was thinking, you know, the folks who came back, we happy few, and it reminded me that, you know, that's from Henry V, right? And the, and Agincourt, and the, I was in London giving a talk. I have to admit something here. And I was in London, and I was on the stage. And I was giving this presentation, and and someone asked a question, and I could have kissed her when she asked the question. She said, "What kind of sequence would you put together using your model to teach Shakespeare?" And I was like, "Oh God, I can't believe she asked that," because I could give examples and non-examples of Shakespeare. I could actually, from a London stage, recite Shakespeare. And I did that, and I took the advantage. So I can say that on a London stage, I've actually recited some Shakespeare. So I was thrilled by that, and that was one of the high points of my life so far. So I was very pleased. I was thinking of another example of the near and distant one, and it's a story I heard a couple weeks ago, and that it was about a funeral home. It's a nice, happy topic. And it was a woman had just lost her husband and quite old. And the widow was sitting there, and she's quite frail, older woman. And the funeral director sits down next to her and to comfort her and says, "Dear," he says, "how old was he?" And she goes, "Oh, he was 110. He goes, 110? That's amazing. He goes, "But how old are you?" And she goes, "Oh, I'm 108. He looks at her and says, "Well, it's not really worth the effort to go home now, is it?" Never mind. I know, I know that's terrible. I know it's a terrible joke. I know I had to do it, but it wasn't near. Oh, people can be mean and nasty. What can I say? All right. And so I once wrote a paper on abstract tax, of all things, with my wife, and she allowed me to write the introduction. And she didn't know why I wanted to write the introduction so badly. And it's because I'd heard a joke in Italy that I really liked. And I had to figure out a way to work the joke into the paper. So I worked and worked and worked at it, and I actually got it into the footnote of the joke. And it was really, had to do with the abstract tax beautiful, and how, in different contexts and so on. So if you want to, you can go on to the analysis of verbal behavior and look up Robbins and Lang and read the joke. I won't tell it to you here, but you can go into on abstract tax and in Robbins and Lang and read about the paper is actually pretty easy to read. My wife is much more clear than I am most of the time. But I wrote the joke in there, so I get credit for the joke. We talked about distant, and then its opposite, near. Well, this is what we call a coordinate concepts. And what you find that oftentimes it's easier to teach two concepts at once than each one in isolation. And sometimes even three concepts at once. Because an example of one concept is a non-example of the other, and vice versa. So in the case of distant and near, they're best taught together. One, if you remember right before the break, we talked about the comparative separation against the standard, and this one, the comparatively close versus comparatively far. You need both to juxtapose against each other. But this extends to things like solid, liquids, and gases. Those are also coordinate concepts. So then a non-example of a solid has to be a liquid or a gas. All right? And a non-example of a liquid is a solid or a gas, and so on. And so those are best taught as coordinate concepts. So we don't have time to go into that today, but understand that you don't always teach just one at a time. And it's often a coordinate concept. And I'll tell you where to get more information about that a little later. You can actually get even fancier in that what we call, and what we do when we do our analysis, we do hierarchical analysis of concepts. And that means that there is a superordinate concept, that the subordinate concepts inherit the properties from the superordinate and then add another one to become its own class. So if I say a polygon, right? It's made up of closed straight lines, right, that are closed. Now, it can't be curved, right? That's not a polygon. It has to be straight and it's a closed line. Those are the critical features of polygon. So if I say a triangle then is a polygon with 3 sides. I've inherited the characteristics from polygon, which makes me then be able to teach triangle just like that. And so by examining the inheritance structures and teaching that in terms of the inheritance, I can teach progressively complex more concepts actually easier than it was to teach the original concept. And we did this whole analysis for geometric figures. And we see how the mistakes are usually made. For example, you'll often see a square and a triangle placed on the same coordinate list for kids to discriminate, and it actually shouldn't be there. Triangle is there with quadrilateral, 4-sided polygon versus 3-sided polygon. All right? Types of quadrilaterals are squares and rectangles and so on, right? Parallelograms. So quadrilateral then has other elements, but you only have to keep adding one more feature, a defining feature, each one, once you do each level. And you find out you can teach these things and differentiate them, the kids will learn them really fast. So there are all kinds of things that once you get into this, that we're just scratching the surface on, and we're going through, you know, when I teach this in a course, this goes over many days, what we're doing today, of course. You know, this isn't one workshop. So I understand what you're going through here, the pain and the agony and the suffering of trying to figure out what the heck I'm talking about. So I understand that. And putting up with one really bad joke. So. All right, so let's talk a little bit about teaching concepts. So if we were going to design a sequence to teach distant, all right, one of the first things we would do, and that it's really necessary to do, and this is true if we're teaching concept of chair or anything else, actually. This isn't applied just to distant. That's just there, is we want to look at the range of our examples. And what that means is how far out on the example domain do we want to travel for the type of learner we're teaching. That range is going to be different for someone in 3rd to 5th grade versus someone 6th to 8th, 9 to 12, let's say. And so it's not the analysis of the critical features that actually changes at those grade levels, but the varying features. There is one exception to that, but I'm going to gloss over it. So remember the Chihuahua running through and the St. Bernard? Well, do we want to go out to the levels of all dogdom to find some scruffy example of dog that no one's ever seen that happens to exist and fall in that category? And we're not going to say our kids know the concept of dog until I find that scruffy creature out there, right? And or this concept of Sasquatch, that's what everyone in Seattle has to learn. Yeah. And try to find examples of Sasquatch. It's a really daunting task since it doesn't exist. I've often wondered why they've never found a body of a Sasquatch. You know, they have found an orangutan that was 12 feet tall, the bones of an orangutan that lived 50,000 years ago in Borneo that is 12 feet tall, but they can't find one Sasquatch. So, I mean, that all tells you something, all right? But, so you want to look at the range of what you want to teach. So when I'm teaching solid, liquids, and gases, I'm going to restrict them to those things which are pretty commonly in the world of my learners. As I move up the levels, I'm going to extend it into more scientific environments. And finally, I'm going to bring them to the border of plasmas, which then actually create a fourth state of matter. So I'm going to move that range along as my learners progress. And so we don't have to take them to the range, but it doesn't do a bad idea to really explore that when you do your concept analyses. So usually you get it out, you do the biggest range you can, and then you say, you know what? I just need a subset of these and I'll be happy. So I make my example, non-example set based upon my subset. But it's something that I agree upon or agree upon with others who are invested in this. They'll say, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And you recognize that's the range. Once you've got your range identified, what you'll want to do is identify your minimum teaching and testing sets. These are your rational sets. Now remember the believe with all the, how it had the rationale for each inclusion of each example? That's a really good exercise because that makes sure that you're not duplicating something that has already been varied and make sure you're not leaving something out that needs to be varied. So when I have students or people that are being trained in our company, they always have to provide the rationale, what's the reason for including that example or that non-example. The minimum number of examples you need are going to be based upon the number of categories you have under any subcategory. The largest number in the subcategories under any individual category will be the number of examples you'll need. The number of non-examples is always 1 minus the number of critical attributes. However, there are times when nature doesn't cooperate. You know, insects have 6 legs and 3 body parts, but you won't find anything with 2 body parts and 6 legs. They don't exist in nature, right? And Sue Markle suggested maybe you create a humbug. Maybe you have to invent a creature. But so sometimes in nature you can't, there isn't an example with all the critical attributes varied. The same thing kind of in the concept of morpheme. It's a linguistic unit that cannot be broken down into further linguistic units, has the same meaning in each word that it occurs, and carries a stable meaning from one construction to the next. Well, unless you're doing a comparison, which is very difficult to do in presenting examples, non-examples, that third attribute's really tough to vary. So most people, when they teach the concept, don't. They just concentrate on the 2. Is it broken down into, smallest meaning unit, and does it contribute that meaning? So the word catsup spells C-A-T-S-U-P, the word cat is a small linguistic unit, but it's not contributed to the word. It doesn't have anything to do with that, all right? Catnip, on the other hand, does. All right, same unit, it contributes, all right? So these types of things and these exercises that one goes through are very critical, and we develop our, now I mentioned teaching and testing sets. You have to duplicate what you're doing in the teaching set in the testing set, because you must teach with new examples and test with new examples and new non-examples. If you're testing with what's presented in instruction, they could just be remembering it. So you always, in the concept level, always are teaching with new examples and non-examples. So when people say, are you teaching to the test? And I say, well, I'm teaching to a test, not the test. In other words, I am teaching to a test of whether they can see novel examples of these and identify them as such and distinguish them from novel non-examples. And that's critical for your assessment. And then you got to, like I mentioned before, you have to build a bunch more because you probably can't do it with the minimum set anyhow. I spoke earlier this morning, so I don't remember what I said to that group, what I said to this group necessarily, whether I'm repeating myself or I'm leaving something out. So, but I did say that in the reading comprehension program, we have hundreds of examples and non-example sets that apply to each of these concepts, literally hundreds, because we have to keep bringing them out of a pool and presenting them to learners until we get them at exactly the right varying properties and so on. So it's so that took some time. So, you know, you might want to think what that would be for distant. You know, what would be your minimum sets? You'd have to have at least 2 non-examples, no standard, and also no separation. All right? And so this is, you know, and you have to struggle with those non-examples and come up with then your range of examples, which would be over the 3 areas. And then you'd have to look at under temporal, social, and the spatial differences, distance. How many categories do I have under that when I've fully gone through it? That'll be your minimum set of examples. So this is what you'd have to do in setting up to teach distant. All right, now, you remember this set here. The thing we have to remember is that when we're setting up our sequence, we want to make sure to juxtapose examples and non-examples, matching the varying properties while illustrating the must-have property. You want, if at all possible, and sometimes given nature, it's not always 100% possible, but as close as you can, you want to present your example and non-example match sets such that the learner, only distinction they can make between these two is based upon the must-have feature. All right? This matches directly. All right? So, in the case of the designing a sequence for distance, we're going to have to switch between near, far, and near. We're going to have to switch the objects that we're dealing in, far in one, near in the other. And we'd want to use the same objects. That's how we'd match it, right? Use exactly the same thing, but one's near, one's distant. And have the kids discriminating a range of those with the same characteristics. The goal is to have the comparative relation guide the behavior, not the actual objects. You have to take care that the actual objects are not what's governing it, but it's the relation between the objects. The relation between the objects are just as concrete as the chair sitting in front of you. It's part of a stimulus that they can observe, that they can see and can respond to. It's not an overriding psychological relational thing that they get into and bounce back and forth between. It's actually there in front of them. It's either here or it's here. It's either there, way out there, or it's here. All right? You just have to make sure you're varying it appropriately. All right. Now remember these guys, right? Everybody have these in their home, by the way? Examples of that wooden chair there. I got one kind of like the first one. But the others I don't have too much. I don't know how comfortable that last one would be. What do you think? Would you want to... that chair there, that thing there? Where would you... Yeah. I don't even know if it would... Can you actually sit in it without falling over? But that's another good question. Well, that's supposed to be an actual chair. I don't know. I haven't tried it. So make sure you have selected an example set that will vary all the can-have features relevant to the range you selected. Now, truthfully, if I were teaching a younger child with chairs, I'm not sure I would choose the third one as part of my range. All right. Now, the second one, maybe. Depends. Definitely the first one. So that's a decision you have to make of how far you want that range to extend. All right? All right, you want to present the juxtaposed examples and not examples. All right, not example sets, and present the number of examples you will need and the rationale for their inclusion. So if I were asking you in another smaller workshop, a little more, I would have you do this actually. That's why it's asking you to do it, but I'm not going to have you do it. I don't want to be run out of here on a rail here. And this kind of thing. But you would present, I'd ask you to go ahead and make up your sets, your rational sets, and come up with them, and come up with your rationales. And you might want to try to do this, you know, for fun later on. It is a fun exercise, but I'm also going to give you a reference where you can learn how to do it a little bit in more detail, and do it with some easier ones first. All right, I'm going to flip through these. When you design a sequence, you want to put them in a sequence beginning typically with an example and then show and match non-example. Now sometimes, depending upon the learner, you have to do a couple examples first because you want to get the varying properties. Oh, this is a chair, and this is a chair, or this is distant, and this is distant. Then you bring up an example and a non-example with the matched attributes and say, which one of these is a chair? And they've looked at the sequence, they look at which one, and they look back and forth between them, and they go, oh, that one. And if you have presented them such that the can-have features are matched, they most likely will get it, and they'll get it without prompting. The prompt is actually in how you've arranged the stimuli. Then give another example, and then maybe another one. And you might have to say, if you find that doesn't work, you have to go back and explicitly say, this isn't a chair. Look at this. This is really different than this one. This isn't a chair. This is. Touch the one that is, okay? Go again. This isn't a chair. This one is. Touch the one that is. Which of these is a chair? All right? And that's called priming, not prompting, because you're not telling them what response to use. You're showing them what it is beforehand. And so you may want to do that type of sequence. But typically, if you do these juxtapositionings, you'll see that the student, the learner will start, oh, that's chair, 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 all the way down. Got it. Oh, okay, now let's go to my testing set. Bing, 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 never seen him before. Bingo. Got it. It really happens rapidly. And it's pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, there's some really creative ways to do this. Think about it for a minute. You ever hear the little card game called Slapjack? And there you turn them out, and when you see a jack, you slap it. And the first one to slap it gets the card, and so on. And if there's a penalty, I forgot what it was, for slapping it, it's not that. There's a penalty for doing it, and so on. Well, you can put your examples on the cards, and your non-examples on the cards, and you can play slapjack. Which one's a chair? Slap it. Oh, no, no. They get really good at looking at it. You can turn this into a game really fast with slapjack. And I once taught the concept of morpheme to 100 college faculty in 15 minutes using this game. And if you could teach anything to a college faculty in 15 minutes, that's it. You should get an award of some type. But it was really surprising because I just put them out there, I put the rule, and I had a third party. I had two people paired up where they played against each other, and then a third party who was the arbiter, who had the rules for what inclusion was. And they're looking at them, and I had them words with parts underlined, and is that underlined part of morpheme, yes or no? Bang, slap it. And they got really aggressive doing it, and they all learned it really fast. So you can do certain things like that, little slapjack games. There's all kinds of things that you can do then. And we actually have an animated version for a product coming up that we do, where you have to play against animated characters, and they're slapping the examples of distant is one of them, as a matter of fact. And they see it there, and distant versus near, and curious, and we have all kinds of things that we do it. Excited, all these types of things we've analyzed and got this, and they have to play these creatures. You can say who you want to be and which cartoon characters you want to play against. You play against 1, 2, or 3 in the game, and the kids just love it. So there's all kinds of things you can do to turn these into kind of fun activities. It doesn't have to be the same, you know, here it is, here it isn't, here it is, here it isn't. You can actually make these into fun games. You can do them, I've seen them turned into board games. Well, if it's an example, you go 3 squares, all right? But if it's not, you fail to include as an example, you gotta go back 2. You gotta, think about it. You can do a variety of things here to make this fun. It's the sequencing and the juxtaposition of the example, not example. That's the critical attribute of concept teaching. There's a lot of varying attributes. All right, and you'd be sharing your sequences now if we were doing this. All right, so let's talk for a little bit about errors. And Skinner, I remember back years and years ago, I became interested in instructional design. I was 19 years old, and the year was 1969. Reminds me of a Monty Python type of thing. It's an old joke. But at any rate, and I decided I wanted to teach. I'd gone through this little sequence in programmed instruction as part of an introductory psychology course. I said, oh my God, this stuff is amazing. I want to see if I can write one of these programs. And so I wrote one for my nephews in the internal combustion engine. And first I had to figure out how, they want to know how it worked. And I said, oh, I'll write a program for you. I'll be back. Don't go look it up. I'll find out. Thank goodness there was no internet in 1969. And, and I told their mother, don't tell them. Whatever you do, don't tell them. And she goes, okay. She says, well, I don't even know. I said, neither do I. That's why I got to come back. I said, I got to go figure it out. So we had to go look up how an internal combustion engine worked, and then I wrote a little program sequence. And I brought it back, and sure enough, they learned it. I was aghast. I mean, I was like in shock that they were actually learning the stuff as a function of the sequence I wrote. I go, oh, my goodness, I better learn more about this stuff. So I wrote B.F. Skinner a letter. And I said, Fred. No, I didn't. But I could have. He was a nice guy. Many conversations with him later. But what should I do to go on in this? And he wrote back and said, well, begin with my book, Technology of Teaching. I look at it. I remember picking up that book and reading a chapter. I just opened it up to a random spot. You know how you do when you get a new book. And I started reading the section. And I read a section in that book that influenced me from that time on. And he was talking about trial and error learning, and that there was no such thing. That trial is talking about an attempt, and error is a judgment on behavior, not behavior itself. Someone's judging it. That both of the correct and incorrect behaviors are being guided by stimuli and having been reinforced in the past. That they were equally valid responding, except one gets you to go certain places and the other one doesn't. It's a judgment on behavior. And I looked at that and said, I've been judged my whole life. I've been making errors through my whole life, and these were judgments, that there were actually forms of what he called stimulus control. They're both forms of stimulus control. One is the one you're after, and one is the one you're not after. And then I ran into Susan Markle, who was one of my mentors, who helped develop this whole area. And she said, you know, Joe, if unintended stimulus control can occur, it will always occur. And I learned that lesson the hard way. No matter how well I designed the sequence, the kids would find some other way to respond to it that I didn't control for in my initial draft. All right? That's why you use your test. So what do you do about that? If we don't assume that it's an error in judgment, an error in attention, an error because they don't get it, it's an error in how we taught it. Our errors are a function of how we taught it because that's a judgment someone would make on their behavior. So the beauty is, in doing this type of analysis, and one thing that led me to it, is that we can deal with errors to the testing set as logical responses based upon the arrangement of these features. These aren't things that are mysterious, and what do we do about it? As a matter of fact, if we've arranged our sequence properly and analyzed our concepts properly, what we'll find out is that we know precisely what stimuli to present to intervene to get them back on the track we're after, to correct the errors. And you can precisely intervene, all right? So, you can have 3 error types. You can have a failure to identify an example as an example. So, here's an example of chair, and I don't identify it as that. I call it something else, or I say I don't know. That's one type of so-called error. That would be called, sometimes in the literature, undergeneralization. I failed to generalize. In psychophysics, it would be called a miss. I'm looking for hits, and this is a miss. All right? I can identify a non-example as an example. That is what I call overgeneralization, or a false alarm. I'm looking for a correct rejection, and instead I'm getting a false alarm. I'm calling something an example that isn't. Now, if I'm just recording errors, how do I know what kind it is? I want to know if they're failing to respond to an example or responding to a non-example as an example. I said there were 3 kinds. All right? Those where we exhibit both undergeneralization and overgeneralization when we're presented with our testing set. All right? It's a mix of whoops, went too fast. Well, if you saw it there, it's a mix of misses and false alarms, or overgeneralizations, undergeneralizations. It's something we call a misconception. We got big problems when we have misconceptions, all right? We got to go right back to the drawing board, basically. All right. So, if we have a failure to identify an example as an example, what do? Well, we need more examples illustrating the missed example's varying property. Now, here's what's important. Not only do we need to record that they missed an example, we need to know the type of example it is, which one they did miss. Now, remember what we did? We wrote out our rationale of what the varying properties were. Well, we know they missed this example, but not another. That means that one of these properties is not fully being recognized as belonging to the varying properties of chair. That for some reason they see, for example here, something that maybe, stool, I don't know, and we give them this example, and we can then say, well, is it the color? Is it the green? Is it the fabric? Remember the one they didn't know was our little chair, the little blue chair? You know, what was it? And here's, we can drill down on this, right? So in this example, maybe it was a color. So if I were to present this, and now they say, oh, chair, guess what? Blue. Anything blue, they're not calling chair. I never had a blue thing in my example set, so they don't call anything blue chair. Blue is always in my non-example set. I made a mistake. It's blue. I know exactly how to fix it. I have to give them blue examples. Yeah? Or the fabric. Or perhaps it has nothing to do with the fabric or the wheels or any of that, but it doesn't have arms. I find out that now they never say chair in the presence of something that doesn't have arms. So I need more examples of armless chairs. That make sense? So you can see how our analysis tells us and leads us into exactly what we have to do to fix the problem. In our programs, we automate this process. So the program, because we've got all the variable and attributes tagged and so on, it goes through, it selects which ones the learner is responding to, compares it to the ones they responded to in the past, and selects an example based upon that analysis. All right? That's pretty cool. All right? So, if you identify a non-example as an example, you need more non-examples illustrating the incorrectly chosen non-example and the lack of the critical attribute. So, if this is chair or I don't know, I need to give some examples of this, right? And say, this isn't. I got to provide more non-examples, and then I got to test those things that look like that to make sure they got it. If I go back to the original one that I had that they didn't get right, well, they may have just learned that not to call that one. So I have to come up with a new one. So I fix it with one of these. I say, you know, this isn't a chair. Look at the legs. Look at the difference here. Look what's happening. Okay, and then a little later on, I present them this. Is this a chair? You know, what is this? Oh, that's not a chair. That's a non-chair. It's like my kids, you know, when they came in. Dad, may I sit on the non-chair? Yes, you may. You know, no, I say, can I sit on the couch? Yeah. So you can teach these coordinate concepts, all right? But you get the idea that as we move through here, that it becomes possible to precisely define what the intervention needs to be to fix any of the undergeneralizations, overgeneralizations, or misconceptions. Now think about that. How oftentimes when we go through a sequence, we say, oh, they're not getting it, I got to figure out what to do. Oh, I got to figure out how to present this. Well, this will tell you exactly what you need to do. And it's true in regular ed, it's true in special needs, it's true in college teaching. Now here's another thing. You're all gone to college, or assume so. And if you've got kids, you've read tons of textbooks. Have you ever seen a textbook with a non-example? Try to find one. And yet they're supposedly covering concepts, teaching concepts. Have you ever seen them with a range of concepts? So when you're helping a child with homework, finding a non-example for them can really have a big impact. You see it in math. You work the problem, but you don't see one incorrectly worked and compare the steps that are missing. Find the missing step. Did you see that? No. Now, you can develop procedures to kind of build your own in and build your own patterns in the study, but it's not part of a curriculum and it's not part of our textbooks. It's really sad because this is a really powerful set of procedures that can be done and implemented. It'd be nice if they were actually in the textbooks and in the materials the kids used. Right? How many kids, here's an interesting thing, is that this whole notion of discriminating example from non-examples even goes back to the level of the multiple discriminations we were talking about. There's been research studies which have demonstrated that, say you want to teach a child to write numerals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And they have actually done studies where they have kids practice. And they have another group, the control group, who doesn't practice writing numerals. You know what they do? They spend some time discriminating poorly written numerals from well-written numerals. And they look at the whole range of how you can poorly write them versus well-written. Is that a well-written? Oh, is that poorly written? C marked a well-written numeral. Find all the well-written ones. Find all the well-written 2s. Find the 8s. Find the 7s. And a group of them, they're scanning, they find them all. Now you say, oh, now we're going to learn how to write it. They learn it just like that. Why is that? Because they start to make the 1, and if it begins to vary away from what they've learned was a well-written numeral, they self-correct. That's built into our reading programs. We actually teach speaker's own listener on how to self-correct when you hear yourself. If what you're saying is varying from what you learned to match to, then you need to correct it. You need to adjust to it. And that's why we can teach reading without hearing or seeing the student. We have a beginning reading program that takes the kids from 0 to mid-second grade level in about 30 online hours of instruction. Over 600,000 kids so far. 30% of the kids in Tennessee. Then I'll tell you a punchline about this. But it takes a beginning reader who, we don't require letter discrimination. We don't require any of that. To the mid-second grade level of reading in about under 30 hours. Now, that's not 30 continuous hours. You don't strap them in a chair for 30 hours and say, 30 hours you're going to learn. But it's, 20 minutes, 3 times a week, over a period of weeks, you learn to read. If the school does all the 80 lessons, does it 3 times a week, and the kids are encouraged to speak out loud, and they're not at grade level, we give the school the money back. We're the only program that offers a money-back guarantee. If the kids haven't achieved the criteria, we give the money back. You only pay for success. If you use our program the way we suggest, which isn't hard to do, we're talking 20 minutes 3 times a week, right? If you use this program the way we recommend it, and these kids aren't where we say they're going to be, you don't have to pay for it. Only company that does that. And how do we know that? Because we went through painstakingly and analyzed and looked and used these relations and built these in the programs. All right? That's pretty cool, huh? And so once you're, and I've said this already, but your learner's errors can be precisely corrected. Once the concept analysis is complete, it's all hinging on this concept analysis. And you'll likely need more than 1 minimum teaching and testing set. Simply because this is the minimum, all right? You're going to need more. But if you have that, you're in a good position. All right. Now, I was going to have you go through and analyze a concept of your own, but that may be near and dear to your hearts that you get through. I don't know if you want to do that. This room isn't necessarily conducive to doing that type of thing. But it's actually a great exercise. How many would like to do it versus, we got a half an hour. Would you like to take a crack at just picking one on your own? It doesn't have to be a hard one like distant or believe, it can be much easier. But think of something you want to teach one of your learners that you'd really like to do. And maybe one of you, maybe form a group and pick one concept in the group. You don't have to each one do a concept. So form groups like you did before. Yeah, let's do it. What the heck? What else we got to do? And let's analyze a concept. Critical attributes, varying attributes, and if you get a chance, your rational sets. And if you just form groups and try it, and I'll walk around and do what I can to help out. And just pick out one concept in the group. Something that you think can be done. I'll tell you what not to pick. Don't pick bed. That's a hard one. Yeah, oh my God, it is a hard one. All right. Everybody hear me here? Okay. We're about ready, supposed to wind this down here. And I've been around the room, and you've done a great job of finding these concepts, and for the ones that I saw. And there were some really, really good ones. We just had a great one on what's completed, another one on mine versus yours, and other ones on things like even a toothbrush. That was pretty good. And and what is mad, as in angry, not as in Mad Men, the TV show. All right. All of these things, as you go through, you'll find that it is not all that easy, but it is doable. And as you practice it more and more, it becomes, and I have the, how can you say, advantage of having done this for many, many, many years, all right? So, and how I got to be able to do this is right here is a book that if you order this book and you go through chapters 4 and 5 of this book, the other chapters are great too, by the way. It starts out with paired associates and goes to multiple discrimination and algorithm learning, and then it goes to concept learning, then principles, and then strategies. This tells you step by step, it's a self-instructional guide that takes you through how to do exactly what we talked about today. And first, chapter 4 is what is concept learning, how do you know it? And then chapter 5 is actually how you analyze concepts. Then a part of the appendices are well-written and poorly written concepts analyses that you can look at and you correct for procedural errors. For example, if you have the word and or in your critical attributes, you probably have an embedded variable property. You'll learn that. And and you'll go, and it takes you through systematically how to go with this with lots of examples and non-examples. And the book, I think, is like, they sell it for, I think, 20 bucks at most. All right? I highly recommend getting a hold of that. And if you're interested in what we're doing, now here's a hint about going through that book. One, don't read it. Work through it. They have you do exercises as you're moving through the book. Do those exercises as you move through the book. And it's an exercise after every paragraph, basically. I mean, they have you do something, even some little question, or you have to make a decision about whether that is overgeneralization or undergeneralization, or what would you do to fix it. That's all in the book. Also, they have a set of appendices. It's best to work through the appendices as you go through the book. So when you look at concept learning, you go to the appendices and look at the concepts, appendices, and work through them as you go through the different chapters corresponding with it. And you'll find that that particular book will actually give you the practice that you need in order to do what we talked about today in this workshop. And I hope that you found it valuable. I found it valuable. It has resulted in me being able to produce some really wonderful programs. I mentioned earlier, I believe, that we're doing a science program with the 200 hardest concepts to teach in science instruction. That'll be out for teachers. Our whole early reading and reading comprehension programs are based around these types of analyses. And I find it gets around a lot of the issues of generalization, teaching complexity, and so on to children. If one takes the time to do this type of analysis and then spends the time sequencing the stimuli appropriately. And the third thing is coming up with fun ways to do it, like those games, the slapjack and so on. That's where your own personal creativity really comes in terms of sequencing these. And if you do that, I think you're going to find that your higher level learners will even be much higher and can experience a richness of contact with the world that they wouldn't otherwise. Well, thank you very much for attending. Appreciate it.
Okay, I've got the code, the verification code, R